having said all that, I really do think that the reason that Danny is doing so well is because of the early interventions that we put in place in the beginning. And to explain the reason for why we put all these early interventions in place and for you to kind of understand my thought process and where we came, I got to tell you the story about Danny. And I will sort of read this one because I will tend to go off on different tangents with this. But Dr. Duncan talked about the breech birth, talked about low, minimal movement. Absolutely, that was classic. And this was my first child, so it was the typical doctor's, it was Navy medicine. So, I won't say, I'll try to be nice, but it was Navy medicine, and the doctors wouldn't believe me when I kept saying, there's not a lot of movement. You're a first time, you don't know what you're talking about. They put the thing on, look, he's moving. Well, it's not no movement, like Dr. Duncan said, it's decreased movement. And sure enough, decreased movement, Danny was breech, had to come out of C-section. So when he was born, he had pneumothorax, he had a punctured lung, and they immediately took him to the NICU because of the difficulties of breathing. And while he was in the NICU, all of a sudden he started to lose his reflexes. Now his APGARs are normal. You go back and look at them, they're completely normal. All of a sudden he just starts to lose all these reflexes. Stops moving, stops sucking, everything else. They start saying, oh, is he premature? Are you sure? No, he's not premature. I think it was 2 weeks past or something like that. Trying to figure out what was going on. Again, this is a naval hospital, and not that they were limited, but I don't think they'd seen anything like this happen before. And in addition to the punctured lung, the APGARs were good. He had small VSD, and doctors, if you know what VSD what that stands for, you can say what it stands for. It's not murmur anymore, but it's a little heart murmur type thing. And he also had a pectus excavatum. He had a sunken chest, which my husband has as well. But they didn't think, they just started putting all these things together. Okay, something's wrong, and trying to figure out what it was. So they went ahead and did a genetic profile. The Portsmouth Naval Hospital only had the standard. They couldn't do anything further than that. They didn't even have a geneticist on site. So they did that, came back normal, no issues there. So they decided to perform a CAT scan. So they performed a CAT scan, and at 4 days old, they came back and they told us that the CAT scan showed that a third of his brain was missing and had not formed. And where there should be ridges, it was smooth. And so at that point, we came in and we put a do not resuscitate on him because we had a friend who had a child with a very severe disability, and a third of a brain missing is extremely severe, and we understood what it had done to the family, so we went ahead and put a do not resuscitate on him. And at 2 weeks, we went ahead and took him on this. They were doing some more tests. They finally decided to go ahead and release him in our care, and we were putting him into a home for disabled infants, which was in Norfolk, Virginia. That home for disabled infants was associated with the Children's Hospital of the King's Daughter. So we took him home, and right before we took him home, I decided I wanted an MRI. Because being the control freak that I am, I'm still trying to figure out, what can I do? It's like I've got to regain. I kind of want to figure out what I've done wrong, what I could do. I've been researching hyperbaric chambers and all this kind of stuff, and I want an MRI. So I asked him to do an MRI. They performed the MRI. We had taken Danny home with this do not resuscitate. I called back to the Naval Hospital and I asked them what the results of the MRI were, and the doctor, the same doctor that I had in there, told me that it was the same as the CAT scan. I said, okay, well, here's the dramatic, I don't have to do the dramatic effect for you guys because it was wrong. That CAT scan was wrong. That doctor lied about the MRI. Well, what happened, and the way we finally found all this out, was that we went ahead, dropped Danny off, dropped him off with a curve kind of thing, but we took him to this home for disabled infants, checked him in, and the next day had come back, and we're sitting there with the doctor going over everything, still trying to figure out what's going on, still thinking he has severe brain damage, still has a do not resuscitate. While we're sitting there, a nurse walks in, puts a piece of paper on the doctor's desk. He looks down, looks up, and he says, we need to take the do not resuscitate off your child right now. And I said, what are you talking about? Why? He said, there's nothing wrong with his brain. So we just sat there, and as you can imagine, first shot all the emotions, and I looked, I said, first, it was kind of dumb, but first thing I said, are you sure that's Danny's MRI? Well, of course it's Danny's MRI. Well, what happened, what we found out later, first of all, that a nurse from Portsmouth Naval Hospital had anonymously faxed the results of that MRI over to the home for disabled infants. So we wouldn't even have that if it hadn't been for that. And then secondly, what had happened was that an HM3, a technician, had actually made a mistake on a CAT scan and had caused shadowing. And he was tired, he didn't know how to work the equipment, he was new, and nobody double-checked his work. That was a mistake. So Having said that, the point on that is I hope that, not just parents, caregivers, but doctors, you all realize we're all human, always get a second opinion, and always possibly ask for another test, especially when something is, as life-threatening as that is. So at this point, we needed to find out what was wrong. And we had done the SSI, we checked Danny into this home for disabled infants, and he was in there, and it was a big deal, and we made the decision to go ahead and leave him in there. And he was in there for 6 weeks, and the great thing about the hospital at that point was that they allowed me to come in after being up all night researching and saying, okay, now test for Miller syndrome, now test for Turner syndrome, now test for SMA, now do this. And they did everything I asked. And they were doing their own research as well. So that was the nice thing. And he had this round-the-clock care. And finally, 6 weeks, we took him home. A week later, we found out that he had Prader-Willi syndrome. And he had, again, by UPD, and there's a different kind of test. And this is back in 2001. So, if you think about what Dr. Duncan was saying in a timeline, everything was still kind of new. Growth hormone, all of that. And there was a test called methylation PCR, correct me if I'm wrong on that one, analysis. That was used to find this uniparental diastony. And one of the doctors had said, don't just do the fish, which is another way of it. He says, try this one. And they said it's a more rare version, is what they say, 1 in 25,000. Personally, I think it's more common. I think that there are a lot of individuals running around with Prader-Willi syndrome. When you see that child, like you said, the child's a little bit slower, they might eat more. I mean, it could be that uniparental diastony. I think there's just a lot less that haven't been diagnosed. So having all that happen, at this point I went, brain damage or Prader-Willi syndrome. I can fix Prader-Willi syndrome. I'm not quite sure I'm brain damaged, but I can fix Prader-Willi syndrome.